as she said, from EnviroAce. She's a professional engineer with 23 years experience managing compliance and permitting issues and identifying and remediating contaminated properties, which is what we're here to talk about tonight. Her broad technical experience includes investigation, permitting, design, construction oversight, project management of environmental engineering projects. And you founded EnviroAce, Mary, in 1999, and you've been working with ECVA since 2006. And I know that you'll mention to the group too that you also work with Eileen Mahoney, who's not here tonight, but you'll give us some more information. So we'll turn it over to Mary Rudy.
Due to my engineering background, I partner with Eileen Mahoney, who has a PhD and does the risk assessment work associated with this project. And we'll do a lot. Bulk of the work when the pending proposed plan comes out, looking at the risks that were evaluated as part of the feasibility study, because the basis of what they do depends a lot on the risks that are assessed in the project. I'm happy for you guys to give me guidance on how you want this meeting to go.
Well, and just real quickly, let me just mention a couple of things. One, Mary requested these to be here, so she might make reference to them as we move along the conversation. But these are some posters that I picked up from EPA that they have used for some of their stakeholder meetings that they've had to share information about the project. So encourage people to take a look at them maybe at the end of the meeting as well, if we don't specifically mention any of them. And there's a map, obviously, of the landfill, which I'm sure you've seen, and then some specific facts and things like that. I'd also like to say that if there's any questions you might have regarding, our work in this project, DCVA has been involved in this project, as Debbie said, since about 2006 when we received funding through EPA. I became the TAG project manager on behalf of the board, I guess 2 or 3 years ago now. Before that, there was a gentleman on the board named John Firth that was in charge of that. So I did initially apply for the grant. He had, so there may be certain questions regarding that history that I may not have answers to, or Mary may, because she has been on the project much longer, but we're more than happy to help in any way, share the information, talk further. Welcome to our board meetings as well, and any opportunities we have to move forward. One thing I will mention though, and I had talked about this at the previous meeting we had with some of the board members here, is that the technical assistance grant was on hold. A lot of the funds had been diminished because there are 2 landfill sites that fell within this one operating unit, and they eventually split them apart. So we were responsible for both the Clearview and the Fallcroft. Fallcroft took its own path. It was a much longer timeline in terms of evaluating and assessing the risk. And they also were going after potential responsible parties. For the Clearview, they were moving at a quite faster pace, although it seems long in the broad scheme of things. And so at that point in time, eventually we ran down the grant money. There was supposed to be more money available, but because of sequestration, they had to hold off at this point in time. So essentially, Mary's operating off the last little bit that we had left to share information, which I think is great. But just so you know, we're like at limited capacity for a short period of time, hopefully, but I just wanted to put that out there just so you realize that, where we're coming from as well. So I'll just turn it over to Mary. I think they had wanted more like just a quick background, like where we are in the project, what the timeline, like what information has been presented so far and to where we are today, and then see if people have direct questions on any of those particular aspects.
Just to add a little, I think I think bringing us along the full timeline just briefly would be helpful, just to get us to speed as to all of the work that's been done, and just kind of where do you think we need to be able to even think about where we are now, which is anticipating the issuance of the proposed plan. So kind of getting us caught up, and then any comments you have, since you were at our meeting with the Water Department and Army Corps and EPA, any comments you have about sort of how the Clearview remediation intersects with flooding
issues. I think would be helpful as well.
And I think also, Mary, that you should speak to the issue of the health risks specifically for Eastwick relative to the history of Clearview. I understand that there is some confusion about that, that some people say that there's no health risks, others have identified specific health risks. So we would like to hear on that issue as well.
Okay, I will talk a bit on health risk. It's not my area of expertise.
Okay.
So, but I am happy to, and I won't guarantee that I'll have answers for all your questions. The remedial investigation came out in 2011. I did a lot of the work on this project in that time frame, 2011, early 2012, and haven't worked on it that much since then, just because of the way things are published and responded to. So if you have questions I can't answer, I'm going to write them down and we'll give you a follow-up. Okay?
If you could add to just how the development of the design of the berm and the impacts that'll have with Clearview. I mean, you would probably touch on that too, just because there's going to have to be cutting in of and removal of soils, right, of the landfill that may not have been needed to be done, but now will be because of the berm potential.
Has there even been a sketch or anything? We went to that meeting, and again, that was first I heard of it, was not involved at all, and again, pardon, but has not been where I've been looking at things at all. There was no, it was the investigation of the investigation was
Right.
how it was presented, so.
Only that scope of work does say that if you want to give comment, or there was something else that I read, actually, Jackie, maybe something that you had written in here about, in your notes of that meeting, saying something about if you want to participate, if you want to get your voice heard, now is the time we should be working on it, because it's like an 8-month window that we could provide. So, I mean,
I just
So
wanna
might
get- I
have
wanna-
to
I
do
wanna
more
get
with the
caught up.
capping.
Yeah.
But just real quickly on that score, and right, we haven't really seen anything else as it relates to the flooding issue besides attending that meeting. I did have a follow-up conversation with the Philadelphia Water Department. And really, they only have one person right now that's reviewing both what are the options in terms of like berm levy in combination with how that plays out with the remedial action for the landfill and like whatever they do with the capping and things like that. So from what I last heard, and this was just a couple days ago, they're still evaluating. They're still looking for, that technical aspect, experience to come into play. And so I think, DCBA through Mary Rooney will definitely play, an important role in that as well, because again, you want to make sure the two work together and not against each other, in combination with against, anything that would have impact on the community, both, in Eastwick as well as the aquatic community. So from what I hear, there hasn't been much more, but there will be, and the question is, whether or not there's an opportunity to drive that with the board here and DCBA by getting additional expertise on the city.
And just to address that comment, my attitude is always, if there's any way to get your ideas in at the beginning, it's always better to have them incorporated into the thought press before the decisions are being made than get to the point where, like now, a proposed plan is coming out for Clearview. If this is the first time anybody speaks up and says, well, these are my ideas about Clearview, they give you a 30 or 45-day timeline, and a gazillion dollars have been spent doing an investigation already, and this is their idea, and it's hard to move that bus in another direction. So my only thought was, and I'm not involved in the burn in any way, shape, or form, but if you can tweak the ear at PWD or the Army Corps as to how anyone individually thinks things should go, or especially a group, if you get some sort of group consensus, and there's a lot of professional people involved and a lot of residents who already have ideas about what is and has been done or hasn't been done. It's always great to sort of feed that information in. I mean, there was this list of people that came to that meeting, PW, the Corps, FEMA, EPA, they were all there.
Right.
And there's names and there's probably email addresses to just put your ideas in early and often. Josh has been very good about when we've had comments on, he may put the sampling and analysis plan out. And not that we've looked at all of them, but occasionally there's been some money in the budget to look at one and just say, you know, well, maybe we think if you did a little bit more in here or something like that, and you get the work done a little bit more in that direction in the process, sometimes that can affect a final decision. So that's my time is now to try to present your ideas.
I have a question. Now, I read some of the report, not the most recent one, but the one, I think one came up last year. And they had everything in phases. The contamination phase 1 might have been the landfill itself. Phase 2 was the residential area, and phase 2 was the city park.
Okay, yeah.
Now, in that, because I want to piggyback what Terry was talking about. In that, it says that in the city park, where there's a lot of kids all the time, that they had PCB, PAHs, also south and north of the landfill. In the streams, they also had PCB and PCHs. So, but how, do you know how bad that PCB is over there, just by looking at the report?
Yes, there were numbers in the report. And why don't we just tackle that one right now? Okay, I'll bring this one. How about we do this?
Want me to hold it up, please?
Yeah, I think it's good. Okay. So what you were looking at was the remedial investigation.
Yes.
And they talked about 3 areas. And this was like area 1, and then the pink here was the area 2. City Park, they called it, even though if you see here, a couple of the areas in pink aren't City Park, they're actually neighborhood. And then this was area 3, which is called Eastwick. So they had Clearview, City Park, and Eastwick. And they evaluated all of these areas together, but separately. They would talk about, you know, contamination in Clearview, and then contamination in City Park, and contamination in Eastwick. They just did it to sort of represent potentially different end users, if you just think about it in a very general sense. As in what you're saying. Here, there's not a lot of kids playing in the dirt. There's industrial areas and things like that. And then here, there's kids out in their backyards, and even in City Park, there's kids out in their backyards. And what you were saying, and is one of the things that we're going to look at, and I asked Eileen Mahoney, who's the risk assessment person, and I'm sort of backing up, but we're in that in-between stage. So the remedial investigation has been done, and a feasibility study was done where they sort of look at all the data that was collected during the remedial investigation. Because of funding issues, we did not spend a lot of time looking at the feasibility study, and now the money's coming a little more available. So I just had Eileen look at the risks that were presented in the feasibility study from all that data that was gathered. And the feedback that we will provide is, do we agree what EPA said are the risks? You know, sort of like an independent evaluation. But you were right, when there was PCBs, PAHs, a lot of them were found here. And they actually, EPA came in and did an additional removal action here and pulled a lot of soil out because the levels were high enough that they were kind of a threat more immediately. My opinion is they found some hot spots up in here in City Park that seemed pretty high, you know. And I can't, unfortunately, it's been a year and a half, I can't talk to you, but not like hundreds of thousands opposed to 10, you know, or 100. So it was high numbers. But just in an occasional spot, say they took maybe 10 samples here, maybe 1 or 2, they found those. And then even in the neighborhood, they didn't find very high numbers, but they found numbers which are considered above background. In a neighborhood like Eastwick, background isn't a pristine farm field. It's compared to what they would think is some sort of urban background number, where there would be some lead and there would be some PAHs just because of transportation and other industrial uses.
Well, the question is, with that, especially in the city park, how would that affect the kids that's over there 7 days a week?
The idea is they evaluate these risks based on.
Even though they have signs, say, do not enter certain areas?
Yeah. Oh, I know, I mean, even if there's fences right here, and there's holes in the fences, and I mean, if I was a kid, you would naturally climb through the hole in the fence. I mean, that's what we did, we were kids. So the risks are evaluated based on, if they think it's a recreational user, if they think it's a person living there, you know, getting something on your hands and putting your hands in your mouth. I mean, it's that kind of dermal contact. So when Eileen evaluates these risks, you do think about the fact that a kid in their backyard getting exposed to something every day has a higher risk than, you know, the guy working at the refrigeration recycling shop up here, the salvage shop up here, who is working in some place but not putting his hands in his mouth and not getting exposed every day of the week. So is that more addressing how the risks are evaluated? Is that your question?
Sort of, I mean, sort of, but I'm not, you're not saying it's a possibility, you're saying it's a possibility. But I want to know.
So, can I ask a
Yeah,
follow-up?
go ahead.
Then maybe, so, and maybe I'm not getting at the right issue, so let me know. But at this stage, you're looking at, initially you were looking at what EPA was saying the risks were.
Wait, why don't we, let me do a quick background and
Okay,
hold that
that would
question. Let's do that. And I am not gonna go, it wasn't my intent to come here and talk to you about, you know, in 1952, you know, guys were born, whatever. You guys know that history. I would assume much more than me. I'm living in Allentown right now. You know, grew up in Abington. So my thought was, I would just say that in May of 2011, a remedial investigation report was published. Okay, and that, a summary of that report, the report is, they're gigantic. You know, there are 3 binders like this, and, you know, hundreds of tables, and,
And Mary, can you just summarize, like, what is a remedial investigation?
sure. This right here is just the drawings, and I have them folded over in half. I mean, there's, you know, 40 or 50 pages of maps, you know, and each map will have dots on it based on the concentration of an individual compound, a certain metal, lead, you know, or PCBs or PAHs. These reports are huge.
Let
The
me
executive.
just ask this question now. With how, you know, and you can go back over the report, I'll give you my number if you want to get back with me. How dangerous is the contamination with the kids that's over the playground every single day? Plus, along with the programs that they have coming out of the city park. That's really my concern.
Well, the risks, if there's danger more than no danger. You know, the risk is not zero. The intent is, from what I can read, and again, we're going in a million different directions here. From what I did a very quick look at the feasibility study. Again, money wasn't available for us to really review it. But there's enough risk that the intent, when they're planning a cap for this landfill, they call it a evapotranspiration cap. And again, the proposed plan has not been put out, but the way the feasibility study was written, it definitely led to my assumption that this is what they're planning to do. But what they're planning to do hasn't been published, okay? But they're planning they call it a evapotranspiration cap, which is a soil cap on the landfill, several feet of soil with a selection of certain types of tree and bush species that really will hold the soil water in place, to prevent a lot of rainwater to seep through this soil cap and prevent that from getting into the landfill and then pushing more contaminants out. So that's the thing. But when they are planning that cap, this is the answer I'm trying to get to, their intent is to pull soils back. So you know the footprint of the existing landfill. Well, the cap will be, you know, a lot of the contaminated soils will be cleared out from the landfill footprint. They're going to do more excavation in this area of potentially contaminated soils, because there's some pretty heavy contamination here.
That area over there is the industrial park?
That's just some industrial area, they call it, yeah, and then kind of downhill from that. But even in here, they're planning on pulling the soils back from this area and pulling those soils onto the landfill and reconfiguring the landfill to make it, you know, better engineering-wise for this cap to take hold. So the thing I'm trying to get to is there is some risks in these soils. So the intent is, part of the remedy is to get those soils out of there. If there was no risk in those soils, that wouldn't be part of the remedy. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, I
there?
do.
Okay.
Yes, I do.
What is the risk for the Eastwick community overall?
Again, I
What
hate to
is
say,
the-
but I
what are
am
the
a
numbers?
civil engineer. I'm not the PhD. The woman who does the risk assessment has moved to New York. So if I had known this meeting was going to be all about what the risks are for different things, I would have had her come instead of me. I can,
Well, you have to understand, we're residents of this
I-
community. We would not be here if we did not have an interest in knowing what kind of risk we're up against.
right, I completely understand that.
Thank you.
I just didn't come into this meeting really knowing what the purpose, defined purpose was, except to present some information.
Yeah, I mean, you're saying there are high levels of contaminants there, so let's say there is a risk.
Mhm.
Just like you have a place up there near Bartram Village is a brownfield site.
Mhm.
Can't we say that this is a brownfield site? I mean, there are funds to clean up brownfield sites depending on what you want to produce there. I mean, does this always have just to be a piece of empty land there? Can something be built there where, so we can qualify for brownfield money to do it?
The intent is to clean this up through the Superfund program. It's not a brownfield site. This is just a different program in the government. So, yes, the intent is to clean this up. I mean, that is definitely the intent. I don't think there's any intent right now, from what I've read in documents, to put another construction or a economic use to this. I believe it's going to be covered with trees. Okay, soil cover, fast-growing trees.
Can I answer that a little bit? So I think what's actually going on is you have different levels of contaminants in, for example, a brownfield to a Superfund site. Brownfield's here, it's a general term, Superfund site's here. And so if I'm listening to you correctly, Mary, what you're saying is that you're going to take the soil, they're going to push it down, you're going to put the cap over that, and above that they'll plant the trees. In certain things like brownfields, you can pave them over, use them for parking lots. Other ones, if you have a big enough cap, you can use them for residential, but it has to do with state regulations and federal regulations. This is so contaminated that what they're going to be using are trees and will never be put to any other use. But
That contaminant.
yeah, that's why it's a Superfund site.
So, again, back in 2011, they finished the remedial investigation. That culminated from years of sampling, soil sampling, leachate sampling, which is the water that's seeping out the sides, groundwater sampling, stream, creek, sediment sampling, water sampling in the streams. And they did like a vapor intrusion study, so you guys are aware of that. They went into
I
some.
think that was doing inconclusive.
I'm sure they went to Leo's house.
Did they go to your house?
Or
Yeah, but-
close by.
Out of 250 homes, they only went to 13 properties, so.
Yeah, I think initially they might have done a little more, and then they did a follow-up with 13 properties.
Yeah.
So they
that's-
got years of data, they put it all together and generated this gigantic report. There is contamination, it's I mean, the biggest contamination was the PCBs in
Yeah.
terms of like big numbers and more imminent health risks. So there was enough of a potential high numbers, again, you know, some numbers hundreds of thousands, which is not too unusual, that they went in and excavated soil. So they published this RI and they went right in, and they had already hired a team to go back and do an interim kind of remedial action to start excavating. I think originally, and I'm not oriented too well right here, just looking at this, but, you know, say they were picturing on excavating this area. Well, they ended up kind of moving in a lot of different areas around buildings, and they didn't go under any buildings and nothing was taken down, but they kept digging and kept finding PCB contaminated soils, even 10 and 12 feet deep. So you go in, you think, oh, we got some surface stuff here, let's get it out of the way, and you dig 10 feet down and you're still finding, some significant levels. So that activity stopped at that point because they weren't going to go into foundations, and they knew that there was going to be a final measure that was going to take more action at that point. What Jacqueline here was sort of explaining was, one thing, the problem they found with the groundwater is, normally when you're assessing risks, you say, this is the contamination, and these are the levels, and let's assess the risk. But with groundwater, they couldn't define the extent of contamination. There was a groundwater plume heading, I think, in sort of multiple directions, but the time that they did the first round of sampling, they didn't have wells far enough out to get, so you have this well and you have 100 or something, and then so you hopefully have a well here that says 50, and then you have a well over here that says 0, and you can say, okay, we know how far it goes in this direction. Well, they put this well here and they had 1,000, and they put this well here and they had 500, and their last well over here, it's still, 250, just giving numbers. So then they have to say, well, how far down the block do I still need to go to figure out where the end is? So for the groundwater work, they have broken that one out completely. So you have this landfill, which is one investigation. You have Fallcroft landfill, which is now another investigation. And they were always two separate investigations because they're not even contiguous. They're, I don't know, is there a couple miles between them? And now the groundwater here has become its own investigation because in the timeline to get the soil cleaned up, they haven't nabbed it. So like 1,4-dioxin, it's one particular, contaminant they seem to, it's still around. So they put another well up here. I think they put a well right over here. They put another one down here. So it just went further out. So that one is still, that investigation is still ongoing.
So Mary, so we essentially now have another component that is not on the same track as.
There are now 3 components, yes.
But for residents.
Non-groundwater, everything Clearview except groundwater. Everything Fallcroft, which is still kind of intact. And then a groundwater component associated with Clearview.
So for us, we need to also watch that second one with the groundwater, certainly that impacts.
Right.
But that one is not on the same track.
Right, yes. Yes. So they created this report. There's metals contamination. And I'll tell you this, of concern between myself and Eileen Mahoney, we think there is contamination in the soils of Eastwick. So on my radar is, and what I have asked her to keep an eye on when she reviews this is, I don't know what EPA is proposing for actual Eastwick. From what I had read the plan, they're going to put a cap in here, and there's contaminated areas, especially City Park, up in here, there's those couple hot spots I talked about, and down in here, kind of the area like the historic landfill, extended landfill, pull back any contaminated soils, pile them, and I'm using that term loosely.
I understand.
Pile them in, cap everything over, spread some clean soils out. Go
Thing
ahead.
is, well, if they start that spot where there's contaminant, they want to pull it back to the main part of the landfill, wouldn't that be opening up a can of worms? Because
Before
of the
they would pull it back, they just don't go out there with an excavator, they would go out there and do spot sampling all around it to try to figure out if there's a can of worms before they open it up.
Okay.
So they would say, and again, it's been 2 years, but there was basically 2 spots over here that just had higher, and it's really weird. You could say you have really high numbers right underneath where you are, and they took another sample literally, 60 feet away or 50, I think it was 50-foot grid, and that number was relatively normal. And sort of they went in a couple different directions. So there was just these, I won't use the word outliers because I don't know, but there was just these points where there was some high numbers, So what they'll do is, again, put another grid down with smaller, 10-foot, 20-foot, something like that. Do some sampling. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Great.
yeah, they had about the proposed plan was supposed to be out in May or June of this year.
Glacially fast.
Now, and I know that
Glacially fast.
it's been put back, but one of the main concerns was when they mentioned that it's a good possibility that there would be levees. Now, you said you weren't quite aware of that, but at that
Levies have
discussion.
nothing to do with.
But they
the
did
proposed
say
plan.
anything that, as far as Clearview, it would have to be tied into if they was gonna construct a levee or not. That was one of the things that they did bring up at the meeting.
Right, and that, I mean, I was a little confused on that one too. I mean,
Right,
right
so we
now,
wanna
as
know.
I was reading it, you know, you picture the creek, and you picture the landfill coming up, you know, do it this way. You know, here's the creek and the landfill coming up at some point from the creek and then coming down the other side. And then, you know, when I think of a levee, I'm assuming, you know, go a little further upstream, because a lot of times you guys have trouble with the water up here, right? You know, I'm assuming, you know, a levee coming up here, and again, this is totally my own mind. You know, I was just sitting at that meeting going, what's going on? So do they tie a levee into here, but then you can't surely have contaminated water washing against the side of your landfill, because you already have seeps and, you know, down in this area, there's already places where things are seeping out right now. So, you know, in my own mind, you assume then the levee's coming down and then the landfill goes, you know, gets pushed back a little bit. You know, that's what I would see. You know, if you're going to build a levee in here and there's some contaminated soils somewhere in that area, well, you'd have to excavate those all out, because you can't build a levee on one, you know, former debris, whatever was in there. There's not a good foundation to build a levee on. So you'd have to excavate down to get something stable. And then it's contaminated too. So all that stuff would have to get pulled back. And again, then your landfill goes from being this to, you know, it starts a little further over, and I guess it has to go a little steeper, and then you're trying to put trees on the side of it. It can only be so steep to get the soil to hold.
So in your opinion, then, it wouldn't be feasible, is that what you're saying?
No, I have no idea, honestly, I'm just.
Oh, because, well, I mean, we thought you would have an idea about, you know, with that, because that was a major concern about especially the neighbors that live around that area. And they thought that maybe with them constructing a levee, that would eliminate, you know, that would eliminate their flooding in that area.
Well, if they want to do a levee, the levee has to be an intact item, you know. If you want to keep flooding out of here, you have to go as far upstream as you need to hold that line, that elevation line, to keep the water out. Again, in my own mind, unless you were hardening the side of the landfill and tying it, it's all.
My memory from the conversation with listening to Josh Barber was that they do have to somehow tie the levee in to the landfill remediation, but at the same time listening to you, I mean, it makes perfect sense.
I think they have to tie the physical work. The needs of the design of the levee have to be tied into the needs of the design of the landfill. But in my own mind, I'm not saying that the two physical bodies will be tied together. You may have a creek and a levee and a landfill. I don't know.
Because it might, I mean, and I know you're just coming up with possibilities, but to have them be one structure might be problematic because you're relying on contaminated soil to hold back water. That seems like a bad.
Yeah. You'd
That seems like a recipe.
You'd have to harden the side of the landfill. It would have to be, that side of the landfill would have to be an engineered structure, you know, concrete or riprap, or, again, I'm just talking.
It was my understanding in the discussions that we've had that when we look at the berm as opposed to the levee, that the levee had much more to do with a permanent structure than anything else. The berm, for some reason or other, would have an effect of being affected by the weathering process, because it's basically just a mound of sand in a sense. And that the levee situation would be much more engineered and constructed to be able to have a high degree of permanency than anything else. But that's not the reason why I'm here talking. I'm listening to your discussion.
Going to be any berm. I think, to get a
It- it
levy
levied, okay.
or some other means.
Mhm.
And again, the only thing I tossed out there was, is there a chance to more holistically evaluate the stormwater? You know, there's X amount of stormwater flowing down this creek, some volume. And then in a bad storm, there's that volume times 10 or 8, or, you know, you guys can only imagine, I can't, I haven't been there. So one idea is, you know, do you in some way manage the stormwater coming down the creek, some of it, to try to reduce it even upstream some? That's the only other idea I was talking about, taking a more holistic, because there's so many acres and communities contributing water and contributing pavement upstream of this area that causes that, all of that rain to rush off, that causes the floods. You know, and in a huge storm, it doesn't matter how many grassy fields you have, you're still gonna get flooding. But, you know, potentially upstream, there's also some work that could be done with some amount of storage or some amount of changes to the flow pattern to maybe at least reduce some of that. And then, again, I don't think there's going to be any berm. If they were gonna do an engineered structure, I believe it would be a
Yeah,
hard,
that's the
concrete, steel designed,
That's the understanding
engineered
that I have.
structure.
Okay. The other question that I had is, you were talking about taking core samples of various areas to find out exactly where those contaminants are located.
Yes.
Can you give us an idea as to exactly how deep these core samples are going? And, for instance, if they find out that the core samples are finding toxic chemicals 20 feet down, do you think they're going to be going after that, scraping that back, and then pushing that back into, and then replacing that same area from which the toxic material came with good topsoil so that it will not have an effect on the community people?
That's the way it will be done.
That's, okay.
Yes, because even when they have this proposed plan, the proposed plan isn't final drawings of what will be done. This is the roadmap to getting to this goal. And the goal is this: pulling contaminated soils back, covering it all over, putting, 4 feet of soil, selecting tree species so that when rain hits, water doesn't seep through. So, because there's multiple contamination. There's the actual soil that's contaminated here. And some of the worst of it will be removed, taking the PCBs and things that were removed.
Right, right. Now, the residents who live in that area, I know they're quite concerned because I've had conversation with some of them. And I do know that based on what you're saying, I'm wondering if they are taking enough samples in such a concentrated area so as to make absolutely sure that those residents are completely aware of and are completely sure that we're really researching their areas to make sure that we're not missing anything. Do you think we're getting that kind of coverage as far as these samples are concerned?
Well, they have taken hundreds of samples. I guarantee you there's not a sample in everybody's yard. I can look very quickly to see. There's definitely not, I'm trying to guess if there'd be a sample in every block. I'm trying to visually think about the grid of samples, and I'm not sure. And again, these would be soil borings.
Let me help you a little bit. What EPA did, they did those 2 wells at about 5 areas from Saddle Place all the way up to Island Avenue. Each one of the wells, they went down 300 feet, and that determined how deep they was going to go down with their next well. It wasn't 200, maybe about 30 feet, to find out how far the water was bringing the contaminants.
Right, and wells are looking for groundwater.
Yeah.
You're talking about soil contamination.
Soil
So
contamination.
you do wells, but you also do soil borings. So a well is a certain diameter that has to be big enough to support the casing and the structure. Soil borings can be smaller diameter, they get punched in more frequently.
They just did some about a month ago in the city park, soil samples.
But do you think we're looking at approximately, is that a quarter of a mile?
Let me see, the scale
What's
here,
this about?
this is
That whole area?
750 feet.
Is that whole road?
Okay.
Can you give us the demographics of what we're looking at so that we know, I mean, I know you have 3 different
Yeah,
areas
where's
there.
it?
Here's
84?
Eastwick.
Okay, all the yellow, all of the
Yeah,
yellow is Eastwick?
Yellow is
Okay.
Eastwick. These are the houses that border City Park. Here's the recreation area up here,
Okay.
recreation center. I'm sorry,
That's right.
So
I
you got
think this
84th
is-
Street
this is
down at the
Lindbergh.
That- That's 84th Street going.
That's 84th Street.
Horizontal?
No, that's
Yeah.
Lindbergh.
Okay, too
84th.
many people at one time.
84th.
84th is right
Right,
here,
okay.
and it changes
Okay.
names to
And
Hook Road.
and that's the creek right there.
This is the creek, this is the refuge.
Lindbergh coming up.
Many of the people in this room, like Joanne, they live down here.
Okay,
Okay.
okay.
Leo, you live, I think Saturn. You live right.
Okay,
Okay.
all right.
Earl, I don't know, what street do you live on?
No, I'm 78th, which would be off your, on your
Oh,
right
no,
side.
Okay, actually, this is 78 right here.
Okay,
This one,
and I'm
right
off.
here. So this is 78, this is 80.
That's where the school is, right there.
Yeah, the school is right
Right
there.
there.
Penrose.
Yeah, Penrose
Penrose,
and
right.
motivation, watch
And this is
motivation.
80th, and this, the rec center is right near 80th, right? This big building is the rec center.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So
Okay, does that affect the
So we're not
people
gonna-
over at Hook Road, that little, where people live in that area on Hook Road,
There's
you
a
know,
church on the
cemetery?
corner here.
There's a cemetery on the left, and there's people who live on the right.
Oh, over
On the
here,
other
like in
side.
Yeah,
Delaware
on the
County.
other side, yeah.
The other side
Does
of
that
the-
affect?
Delaware County, that's
I
Delaware
don't know
County.
about Delaware, right,
Yeah,
the
that's-
county line, the creek is the county line.
Okay, there you go.
Except
All right.
here, it gets weird. Doesn't the county line
Yeah, 'cause it's-
somewhere like this?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
Oh, sorry, over here,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
sorry.
Okay, it
Delaware
doesn't
County.
follow the creek bed.
So you have Delaware County on the east side of the creek, which is so weird, because you
Yeah.
think it would be Philadelphia. People who live over here is a cemetery.
Mhm.
The only potential effect that they would have evaluated would be groundwater moving in that direction.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Because,
Lifting
Um,
caskets.
sorry.
Oh, my God.
So, yeah, again, pardon me for not starting with the basics. I kind of assumed everybody knew where the land
No, it's
was.
not
No,
a C,
no.
the blow,
Um,
where they were.
So the area, the initial area of investigation was this area, where they did the soil samples, they put monitoring wells in, and then, as we talked about the groundwater breaking out, they didn't find that they had enclosed the groundwater contamination, so they have started putting some monitoring wells. But again, that's only looking for groundwater, and some of them were 300 feet deep to evaluate different, because as you go below the ground, there's different layers of groundwater too, right? The ground surface, 10, 12 feet, there's, they call it like a superficial layer, and that would maybe encompass that old creek bed, historically, I believe, the way the stormwater sort of travels. There was a previous creek bed that the landfill guys just pushed all their junk into. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the aerial photographs. There's great ones at Heinz that show how, there was this wetlands, the cattails and everything you normally think of as a wetlands, and then you see this gray area where the landfill is, and then 10 years later you see more gray area, and then you can actually almost see the cattails right at the edge. They just pushed all this contamination into the old creek beds and just kept pushing and building and pushing and building.
Now,
So,
where is that, you mentioned 2 wells,
Oh,
okay?
you mean it? Five.
they put in,
The
yeah,
five?
they put in 5.
Okay, and how many do we have strung along that
Oh,
area
there's,
from 84th all the way back to
20
78?
wells.
About 20?
Yeah,
Oh,
but
okay.
originally they were put in this area, and then they added those 5 more, again, to get a bigger picture of where the groundwater's going.
And how far out have the wells gone?
Here, there might be one a little further down.
Yeah,
There's
actually, I
one
ran
out
into that one
here.
day, right, like where that TC logo is, they were putting
Yeah.
one in there one day.
Right.
It's not,
Um,
it's on refuge property,
So,
but it's about clear.
They all seem to be within maybe, 800 feet of this edge here. And sometimes it's about where you can get access to. You can't just walk to somebody and say, I'm putting a well in your backyard. Maybe it could be a better choice. Go ahead.
Have there been any studies done, any tests taken to determine if any of these chemicals enter the homes that have been flooded?
The only thing that they have done is that vapor intrusion. No, there's no, as part of this investigation, there's not been, wiping down, or taking physically sort of wiping down the walls of houses or anything like that, no.
There was an investigation one time. They came to our homes and they discovered mercury. And what happened after that, the city This time Mercury in our water. The city came back, water department, maybe about 3 or 4 months later, and did the same investigation, and, there was no mercury. Naturally, the city would say that. It was my house, Rice's house.
That one I'm not
I brought my
familiar
house.
So that probably is not related to Clearview. That's probably looking at what's coming down in the raw sewage component when things are discharged.
Raw sewage
Yeah, so,
in our drinking water?
no, in your stormwater.
Talking
No,
about
I'm talking about
in the
drinking
home.
Huh?
Oh,
Right,
Your
my
town.
question was related to how homes that have been flooded and these waters running
So-
down, the contaminants
I
in
think
them.
the answer to that question, Joanne, is flooding is not the issue, it's gonna be the groundwater. Flooding has to do with superficial water that's coming down the creek that has raw sewage in it. That's the danger there, heavy metals and things that are coming down because things are being discharged directly into the creek during storm events. However, I don't think that it's the groundwater we have to worry about that is seeping down and then moving in all different directions we don't know about.
Well, what he's saying, most of the water when you get the flood is coming from upstream. So you're saying it's, whatever's flushing down from upstream that's impacting the houses per se. When you have a flood, most of the water, water can be coming up through like sewer pipes or manholes, but that again is normally rainwater, creek water mixed together, kind of bursting up because it's coming down the creek and it's running out of places to go, so it sort of creates a water fountain effect a bit.
But we have combined sewers so that Cobb's Creek is one of the worst of the discharges. All the older ones are one of the worst ones, and so you're having, in all of these storm events, raw sewage being dumped straight into Cobb's Creek, which is then what's your floodwater.
Exactly what county is Clearview located in?
This is Delaware.
Predominantly Delaware.
I mean, historically.
When did that happen?
I know, it's
It's crazy. It doesn't make any sense. I understand back in the day when county lines were actually drawn, so are we talking 1800s or 1700s? There was a creek, a branch of the creek was here, kind of like right in this part of the city park where the trail is, and I've been on that trail, it's kind of wet all the time. I would know, I just walked it once in the summer and you're going, gosh, that's really kind of mushy. So you're walking, there's this, asphalt path here that winds up City Park. So that mushy was the original creek bed. So when they drew the county lines, it was much more along following that creek bed. But here's, I just pulled out this. And again, you can't see it now, I'll leave it up here, but if you see this kind of dark gray area way back, even in 53, that was all open water. So here's, this right here is this whole bend. But everything, where Eastwick was, there's some scattered houses, but it was all open water.
In 511, there was the remedial investigation, and then there was the interim remedial action. And then they took a step back and said we can't, because they were digging and finding high levels, they stopped that. So can you just take?
Yes, keep
bring
going,
us up
yes.
to speed, yeah.
Okay, yes, in 2011, then they did, even when they published the remedial investigation, they did this, they said we need to add more information. So there was this remedial investigation addendum, which dealt with the, one issue was historic. There was that old, and I didn't really look into this much, Underground Railroad, possibly an old cemetery. So they sort of, one of the three little legs of this additional remedial information was historic. Did that stuff exist? And if we were going to do work down here, is there some areas we have to be sensitive to digging because of potential artifacts? So that was one. I didn't look at that one too much. The second one was to do more vapor work, because they did an initial vapor study. They got a certain amount of responses. I think they didn't get as many responses as they want. They went into homes. A few of the homes had, I believe, had some low-level gas leaks, because some of the numbers were pretty high, but they couldn't say, because they're just checking for, a certain type of vapor, not everything that's there. And natural gas would set off the meter, just like other gases, methane or something, other nasty gases that could be coming from the landfill. So they went back, and the second part was doing that second vapor investigation where they only went to 13 homes. One of the things we're going to look at again as part of our look, the gist of what I read about it, they said, oh, you know, there's nothing really there. We did a second vapor intrusion look at it and didn't come up with anything inconclusive. So we're at least going to take a look at it and just see.
Well, one of the things they did with the first test, when they did vapor, initially they told everybody to close their windows and the doors, but then it was hot and people was complaining, so they left the windows and doors open.
Yeah.
And then the test was inconclusive because vapor dissipate when it hit town.
I mean, they normally would go to basements, and they're supposed to, you know, I'm assuming they're looking, do you guys have basements?
No.
Okay, then they won't go to basements. I guess they're going just along the cracks in the, you know, where the walls meet the floor, or where, you know, your sewer pipe comes up through your floor slab. So, I'd like to take another look at that one, just to see that bears another look. 'Cause, if you're saying there's nothing there, then no work will be done to remediate anything because there's nothing there. And then the third one was chasing additional groundwater information, and that third one brought this, it was again inconclusive because they were chasing but didn't reach the end, so more work has to be done. Then in October of 2012 was the feasibility study. So remedial investigation basically says we've taken, you know, hundreds of soil samples, and we've taken, you know, 6 or 8 rounds of groundwater samples every 3 or 6 months apart, or, you know, whatever it is. We collect all that data, and we've sampled the creeks, and we've sampled the sediments. The remedial investigation just sort of presents the information, and the information we have. The feasibility study then says, you know, we know that there's these potential risks because there's contamination in these areas that is above kind of action levels, which is a cancer risk of greater than 1 in 10,000 chance. So, and then based on those perceived risks, these are the ways we can kind of minimize those risks. And you know, one is do nothing. You know, another one was to put a traditional like landfill cap, a membrane cap on there, this evapotranspiration, and then all different kind of mixes of some of those alternatives were all proposed, and the costs were looked at, and this soil cap seemed to get good groundwater control. And again, I just read this kind of quickly, but controlled the groundwater, minimized the contact with the people or recreational users, because you have pulled all that contaminated soils back and then put 4 feet of clean soil on top of it. So that is the feasibility studies. They present all these different alternatives, they look at risks. And now this proposed plan will be kind of, the feasibility study, I believe, lent towards this, they call it evapotranspiration cap. Evaporation, meaning the leaves pull the water out of the soil, and you know how you walk underneath a tree and it feels cooler during the day because of all that, the leaves breathing. And so it's the idea that the trees and the shrubs will work to control the soil water, prevent that water from seeping into the landfill. So I believe they've done more cost analysis, and you know, again, looked at the slopes, side slopes, those types of things, and then they're going to propose that this is the way they're going to control potential cancer risks.
Will that contribute to flooding? If they put that cap there, which sounds like it's going to be, it won't absorb water, what will happen to the water, particularly in a heavy downpour?
In terms of its physical footprint, they have to look at flooding, and then they have to, you know, picture a clay model. They have the existing clay model of the existing landfill, which does have trees on it, you know, existing there. And then this happens when it rains. And then they have this new, slightly different shaped model of the new landfill. They have to look at that and say, will that new work cause any additional flooding? And the answer has to be no, as part of the design. And again, they call them hydrologic models, but it's computer models that say, you know, this is what the creek bed looks like, and it's got this much water running through it this fast. You know, if we change the creek bed a little bit by tweaking something, how will that push the water around? You know, will it cause some water to go around the structure in a different way, i.e. head into Eastwick maybe. So they're supposed to look at that, look at all those models and design something that does not cause additional flooding.
I have a question for you, which is in this description. So we have a cap at 4 feet of soil and trees. We also have a high groundwater table.
Mm-hmm.
How, and which is leaching down but also moving laterally.
Mm-hmm.
How are they controlling that?
And again, they have broken the groundwater out.
Right, so we don't know yet, is what you're trying to say.
Right.
Okay.
The idea, the one idea is just to try to prevent additional water moving through the landfill materials into the groundwater. That's what this cap will do.
Right.
But the existing groundwater, because it's tidal, is sort of moving up and down in the landfill. And again, the one thing that has happened over the last, since 1953, that tidal water has been moving up and down, and those 2 or 3 or 4 feet, how big's the tidal change?
5 to 6.
5 or 6 feet. So the contaminated material that's in that 5 to 6 feet over the last 50 years has been seeing this kind of washing action, basically going through it, and just like in your washing machine, it's going to shake some of that dirt loose. So some of the contaminated, or a lot of the contaminated material that's in that 5 or 6 feet, the things that move easily have already moved out of there. But groundwater is a separate entity, so it's not, its remedy is not being looked at in this proposed plan. I think it was a necessary move because of the timeline. They want to actually do something. The groundwater timeline is going to be pushed back a bit. A lot of the risks are much more associated with, I think, for you guys, the surface soils and contact and things like that. So you eliminate those risks right away, and you somehow control the movement of some water through the landfill. So you're eliminating some risks with that towards new material getting pushed into the groundwater. And hopefully it'll help with the leaching of the contaminated waters out the sides. So I think it was just necessary to try to get something moving along without waiting for, I'm going to tell you honestly, chasing groundwater contamination is a tough job because it goes where it wants to go, and there are ways to control, and you can inject things, and but it's a tougher job than trying to chase a PCB contamination that's right here and hasn't moved in 50 years. That's a much easier thing to at least chase down. So remedial investigation, remedial addendum, feasibility study.
I was just curious to stick with the groundwater for a moment, if they were able to characterize what the existing conditions were in terms of the rate and direction of groundwater flow.
They have the top layer of groundwater, I'll call it 12 feet down, just pick a number. The landfill's higher than that, but the surface, the top groundwater layer looks much like the landfill. It mounds in the center and pushes out. There seems to be some, on this side of the landfill, pushes out, and it seems to move sort of down that historic channel. And then over here, groundwater again in the upper layer sort of moves this way and down again this way. And the
So
deeper,
it follows the drainage divide to some extent.
yes, it's, if you look at it, if you looked at the way the the top layer of groundwater is going, it sort of mimics it. The deeper layer of groundwater is flowing, I think they had a groundwater elevation over right about here of about 6 feet, so, and the elevation here, so it's 30 feet down or 20 feet down. And there's no, you don't see any sign of landfill at all, 6 feet, 5 feet, 4 feet, 3 feet, 2 feet, so it's just heading, so you don't even notice the creek there. So, kind of the line for 6 feet is sort of just going this way, so that layer of groundwater is moving in a eastward direction.
To unconfined aquifer of old sands, gravels, and it's moving mostly east, not, at one point I thought it might have been east-southeast. So it's moving
It did
underneath.
sort of, like if you looked at this one line here,
Right.
it's sort of it parallels that a bit, so if you kind of envision it moving that way. I have that one here too. So you can take a peek afterwards if you want.
Yep.
Go ahead. Fallcroft, just a quick one. Fallcroft is on its own track. So, again, Eastwick, here's Clearview. So if you can just look at this red, that shape right there, that correlates with this shape right there. So you get a difference of the scale, much bigger scale here. So Fallcroft is down here. That's still in the investigation phase. I think they've done all the sampling that they're going to do. They've gathered all the data. They have to do a lot of quality control on the data to make sure there's no mistakes at the lab. And that report is going to come out, in theory, in December. But when John Firth, who Jacqueline mentioned, when he contracted with me in December, it's like, John, I hate to say it, but, because John's, more than retired, we'll just say that. I said, it's going to be a tough one. This moves really slowly, He's like, I want to see something before I go. I'm like, I'm with you. So he's still here, so. But these things just move slowly. So in theory, the first report for Fallcroft is due out in December. I don't know if they'll actually meet that December timeline. As did you point out the proposed plan was due in May? We're at 10 June right now. It's coming. I don't have anything to do with it, but I never would bet a horse on the timeline that they give you.
I was just gonna ask Mary then, could you summarize, what were your recommendations to the EPA, like in layman's terms? If you think that's something that what the community should hear as well, what your concerns were?
We had a couple concerns, and I actually, one thing, our first concern was that these numbers were really high here, try to do some immediate removal of stuff, which the EPA was already on board with. Again, if you looked at the data, there were some pretty high numbers. I can see why EPA is going for the route of control that they're talking about, but what I'm going to be looking at is, Eileen and I are going to look at the soil levels and levels of concentration in Eastwick, because it does not seem to me that there's any proposed remedy except maybe some hot spot, they call it. If you put a soil boring in, you get some high numbers, you do a little work in that area. So picture, middle of this table area here, you get a high number, so then maybe you do a few more samples around there, and if those numbers aren't high, then you just sort of, it might be some individual person's backyard or the curb or wherever they put these soil borings. Do some hot spot work in Eastwick. And Eileen is looking at Eastwick a little broader scale, trying to compare the soil numbers in Eastwick with what is kind of maybe an urban normal kind of background concentration. Urban areas have had some lead in them, so there's some lead that is going to be there potentially from years of putting lead in gasoline in cars. But there's some data, again, this is not my specialty, but as she says, there's norms and data out there that says an urban area would maybe normally have this level of lead and this level of PAHs. So she's going to look at the information and see if Eastwick has anything higher than that. I sort of got the impression from just the remedial investigation data that she thought maybe there were some areas where Eastwick had higher levels than would be expected.
But will we be apprised of that information at the time in which that information comes forth?
Yeah, Eileen, when she looks at this, she's going to look at this over the next 4 weeks.
Okay.
So when she does that, she's going to generate some sort of report. And we'll get that out.
And the whole idea is that you are evaluating what EPA is finding and what their solution is that they're recommending, and you're advising. The whole idea of the grant is that you advise DCVA on whether or not that seems adequate.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And again, I didn't spend a lot of time in the feasibility study, but my read of the feasibility study was that EPA, if they were looking at soil contamination and risks associated with the landfill, they were taking action. They had this action plan proposed with the landfill that seemed generally reasonable. If they're talking about pulling back some contaminated soils in these areas and going after them, that seemed generally reasonable. So, and to be cost effective, my thought was we were gonna take a little more time looking at what appeared to be some of the areas they didn't really have much planned for, to spend our dollars there to see if there was something that didn't quite seem reasonable.
And let me back you up on that. I think the most appropriate approach to what you're talking about has a lot to do with the people who live in that particular area. And I think that your strategy, rather than the other strategy, is certainly going to be one. I think that's going to be much, much more beneficial to the overall effects that this thing's going to have on the community, on the residents in that area.
And just my opinion, that EPA has invested a lot of time and money in this design. You can tweak it a little bit, but if that's what they've determined is more cost effective, they have hundreds of man hours in looking at, you know, if that's most cost effective. My thought is, if you want to have some impact, you look at the areas that aren't part of a major design and find some things the community can say, you know, we're okay with the landfill concept, you know, and if you want to go with an evapotranspiration cover, it's worked. You know, they've used it in a couple other Pennsylvania landfills. They're looking at it. You know, that might be fine too, but we really feel that you need to spend more time looking at this concern in these 6 blocks, or, you know,
Exactly.
around the lead levels in the neighborhood in general. Or, you know, Eileen could say, you know, we have looked at, you know, these documents, and she does risk assessment all the time. And again, you know, maybe when we do the next public meeting based on the proposed plan, I have her come in and talk risks, you know.
Yeah, you would think that the EPA's strategy in finding out exactly what's happening in this particular area here would take into consideration the years or decades in which this landfill has been allowed to seep, with water draining down and then moving in the same direction in which you were pointing out, going along with the topographical elevation of the land in that particular area. And because of the fact that has been occurring over those decades, that they would even want to expand their research to just a little bit beyond the area of the landfill. And that will take that research right into the same area that you're talking about.
They did, I mean, the actual area of the landfill is this red line there. So this is the historic boundary of the landfill. So basically, they went here, and this is down gradient, you know, and looked at this. But you're right. I mean, there's soil borings that have been done there. I mean, they do have data, and we're just going to spend a little time more looking at that and just comparing those numbers to maybe backgrounds.
And you'll provide, I'm sorry, will you do?
No.
And you'll provide these, the Darby Creek Valley, so you'll provide them, like as if you're working for them, not EPA. You'll provide them your recommendations on what they can and this group then demand for, because it sounds like, I mean, they shortchanged your hours for a thorough review of the feasibility study. Maybe I interpreted that wrong.
That's just the way it worked out. You know, unfortunately.
Well, I know. But
no, but there was no intent on that. There's never intent.
Sometimes there's a.
In this particular instance, with the way this, as Jacqueline said, Darby Creek got a budget of $50,000, you know, or it was like $47,000 in 2006.
Right.
By the time the remedial investigation report came out, it was 5 years later, and that was one report of now 3 units. There's supposed to be 4 reports on 1 unit, and that's what you get your $50,000 for. You know, that was one report of now one of, so instead of being 4 units, there's going to be like, 4 reports, there's going to be 12 reports. and you still have the same money, you know, so then you're saying, you know, we'll get a renewal of contract. Well, it's just coming in bits and pieces, so.
So it would be good that if in your expert opinion and experience, that if there were other landfill cleanups in say, more affluent areas that weren't being shortchanged, you know, that there would be good information to provide, because that could be one of the points of comment that this group and the association could say, you know, we think we got shortchanged with funding, and then and it's not as thorough as it should be.
There's actually very few tag grants at all. I think EPA, this region of EPA only has about 3, and there's hundreds of landfills. I tried to work, there was another community in King of Prussia that had a Superfund site, but it has, somebody like Darby Creek that actually is a community group or an organization that has its own reasons for existence outside the landfill is much better suited to actually support one of these tag projects because they are so long and there's so much downtime. Again, they hired me in 2006, and I did kind of a review of the background material, you know, the existing documents, presented some of that. And then there was really no work for a long time because there wasn't a lot coming out. So if you have a group that's founded just around, you know, fighting the landfill, the pace of work on the landfill will long outlive the group. So the tag concept, though it's a kind of a neat concept, it needs a group that has its own reasons for existence to support it. So there's very few of them. This is, I'll just give you a quick, when the RI came out, so the RI is this, you know, thousands of page document. So we basically created like a 26-page evaluation. So we kind of took the RI and we followed its format and then sort of commented chapter by chapter, saying, you know, maybe they could have done this, or, you know, this seems normal. And then at the very end, well, and then Jacqueline goes to me, 26 pages, I need a summary of the summary. You know, so we summarized it to, you know, summary of the evaluation. So that got down to about 3 pages, you know. But it's, you know, it ends up being complete bullet points, you know, yes, no, this. And when we did it, we had, I created a little chapter at the back just called discussion topics. And it wasn't really you know, I wasn't repeating any of the other information. It was more saying, you know, because Darby Creek Valley Association is interested in X, Y, and Z, you know. So when the proposed thing comes out, you know, if you guys want access to the creek, you know, just say because it's Darby Creek Valley Association, then, you know, the discussion point will be, say, if you're not going to give us much access to the creek, maybe you can, you know, create a couple areas where there still is access to the creek. Because again, at that point, you didn't know what the remedy was going to be, and you didn't know if they were just going to put a big fence around it and say, you know, we're fencing it off. So you guys, it's the same idea, you know, discussion topics. You know, the discussion topic was, I knew there was a trail. Somebody had told me there was a proposed trail that was running through the area. You know, again, talk with the EPA, make sure that that trail, or, you know, maybe the footprint of that trail is put into the design. It's just the idea of trying to get.
You're giving discussion topics to DCVA to
Yeah,
discuss with EPA.
to bring up to EPA before you get to it. So this is kind of what I was saying about working with EPA and Army Corps now. You know, what do you want? You know, do you guys definitely absolutely want a levy?
Yeah, if it's gonna.
We want the best thing for the community.
Yeah.
Right, but I'm saying you want the best thing for the community doesn't give anybody anything to focus on. So in some ways, I think you need to figure out what you think the best thing for the community is, and say, you know, when you are doing your evaluation, because what was the Corps' term was, they were doing a pre-investigation. So all they were looking at was to try to see where they didn't have good information for the next level of work. So to me, that's always the ideal time to get in and say, you know, this street is the absolute worst flooding, you know, could you please, you know, would you focus some extra energy on, and I'm totally making this up right now, but I'm saying, it's the time to get in, and if you can figure out what concrete things you really want to happen, it's much easier to tweak things in the process. Go ahead.
So, and I agree, and I think one of the things we need to do is come back to the flooding issue and reconvene in terms of our response to the plan for the pre-feasibility study. Because there was a lot of momentum around that an April 10th meeting, but we haven't really come back because there have been so many other things in the offing. I'm wondering around what to do to gear up for the release of the proposed plan. You know, what are you going to be evaluating the proposed plan and similarly providing discussion topics? Like how can BCBA and EFNC work together? What information can be given to the community to get residents up to speed? So how to gear up to that process?
A couple of you could at least, I would go to the remedial investigation. There's the actual EPA document on the webpage. They have a 26-page executive summary in there.
Okay,
I would read that.
okay.
I'm going to look, when I actually get the stamp of approval that the evapotranspiration cover is what they're going for, I'm going to take a little more time looking into that and looking into the other EPA site where they use that in Pennsylvania, just reading up a little bit, checking again, more the engineering side, the logic behind it, get a little feed, and I'm not a plant person, but, how they looked at what plant species to use, maybe talking to somebody else, just seeing if that stuff all seems reasonable. And my basic opinion is that in general, is reasonable for that. When you have a big landfill like this, you cannot cart that material away. It just economically, it blows the ship out of the water, and it would never actually get funded because there's a whole list of Superfund sites that are in line for getting funding. And if yours is more cost effective, it's a little better chance at least, getting some money. So you don't want to, it would be great to get all this stuff out here and ship it somewhere else and have it be somebody else's problem.
I was gonna say, where does it go then? It goes,
Yeah,
contaminated
exactly.
soil goes to
Some of
some
it gets,
else's
yeah,
problem?
it goes
Dumps
to
in
some
the
other
Delaware River?
landfill that's bigger and better,
They tried that before, and put up again, came right back and brought up there after
Right.
about 10 years.
So, again, on the engineering side, I'm actually not doing a lot with the feasibility study because they've picked what they feel is a cost-effective option. I'm just gonna look around the edges just to sort of check up on things. I'm having Eileen look at the risks, and she's actually doing her full risk evaluation of the feasibility study data. And she and I have talked about Eastwick. We've talked about, if we already know they're pulling some of this soil back and we're pulling some of this soil back, you don't need to spend a lot of your time looking at the risks maybe associated with those soils. Maybe you look at the risks in the soils that are left behind, a little bit more. And she'll look a little bit at the vapors too.